Eleanor Hayes had always been a woman of determination. At 79, she lived alone in a small cabin nestled deep in the Alaskan wilderness. A world away from the bustling life she had once known in Seattle. The choice had not been easy, nor had it been impulsive. After her husband, Richard, passed away, the city had grown suffocating, filled with the echoes of a past life she could no longer touch. She had longed for quiet, for space to grieve without the well-meaning intrusions of friends and neighbors. And so, with careful planning and the fierce independence that had defined her even in youth, she had left everything behind and moved to the land she and Richard had once dreamed about but never dared to embrace. Life in the wilderness was not easy, especially for a woman who relied on a wheelchair. Yet, Eleanor had never been one to let limitations define her. The cabin was small but practical, modified over the years to accommodate her needs. Wide doorways, low countertops, and ramps allowed her to maneuver independently. The wood-burning stove kept her warm through the brutal winters, and a small generator powered her essentials when needed. Every 2 weeks, Tom, a kind-hearted man from the nearest town, delivered her supplies, flour, coffee, canned goods, and whatever fresh produce was available. He had tried, in the early days, to convince her to move closer to civilization, but Eleanor had simply smiled, thanked him, and gone on with her life. Her days were simple but deeply fulfilling. She woke early, listening to the sounds of the forest waking around her, the distant call of a wolf, the rustle of branches as a moose moved through the trees, the gentle tapping of a woodpecker on an old birch. Mornings were spent tending to small chores, preparing meals, and reading. She kept a small journal by the window where she recorded her observations of the wildlife around her. The fox she had named Bramble often passed by in the early dawn, his red coat stark against the snow. The eagles nested high in the pines, and in the late afternoons, she could see them circling, their cries sharp against the wind. Eleanor understood the rhythms of the land in a way she never had before. She respected its harshness, its unforgiving nature, but she also reveled in its beauty. The first snowfall was always a wonder, blanketing the world in silence. The thaw of spring brought the return of the bears, lumbering out of hibernation, sniffing the air for food. She had once watched a mother bear teach her cubs how to fish at the river's edge. The patient way she swiped at the water, demonstrating until they imitated her movements. It had been a moment of quiet awe, a reminder that nature moved according to its own rules, indifferent to human concerns. She thought of Richard often in those moments. He would have loved this life. She knew, he had been a dreamer, always talking about escaping to the wilderness. But in the end, it had been she who had done it alone. She could almost hear his voice sometimes, teasing her about how she had finally outdone him. "You were always the stubborn one, Ellie," he would have said with a chuckle. And he would have been right. One evening, as she sat by the window, sipping tea and watching the twilight settle over the forest, she noticed something unusual. A lone wolf stood at the tree line, watching her cabin. It was not uncommon to see wolves from time to time, but this one seemed different. It was lean but strong, with a coat that was more silver than gray, and its eyes, sharp, intelligent, seemed to meet hers through the glass. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the wolf turned and disappeared into the trees. The encounter left her unsettled in a way she could not quite explain. She had always respected the wolves, understanding their place in the ecosystem, but this felt like something more. Over the next few days, she saw it again, always at a distance, always watching. It never threatened, never came close, but its presence was undeniable. She mentioned it to Tom when he came with supplies, and he frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Wolves usually don't linger like that, he said. They're wary of humans. Could be sick, or could be something else has driven it from the pack. Eleanor wasn't sure why, but she didn't think the wolf was sick. There was a steadiness in its gaze, a quiet understanding. She had spent enough time observing animals to recognize curiosity when she saw it. Still, she remained cautious. She made sure to keep her doors locked at night, her rifle nearby, though she had never needed to use it in all her time here. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the wolf continued to appear. She found herself speaking to it sometimes, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "You remind me of myself," she admitted one evening, watching as it lay a few yards from her cabin, its ears flicking at the sound of her voice. Alone, but not lonely, just watching. It was a strange companionship, one built on distance and quiet understanding. And in some way, it comforted her. She no longer felt entirely alone in the vast wilderness. Then, one night, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the walls of her cabin, and the snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. She worried for the wolf, wondered if it had found shelter. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, leaving the world buried under a deep, unbroken white. It was midday when she saw the tracks. They led from the trees to her porch, then away again, disappearing into the woods. Her heart clenched at the sight of them, at the knowledge that, even in the worst of the storm, the wolf had come to check on her. Something in her softened that day. She left out a small offering, nothing much, just some scraps from her meal, placed a safe distance from the cabin. She told herself it was foolish, that wild things should remain wild, but she could not ignore the connection she felt. The wolf returned that night. It did not take the food immediately, but it lingered a little closer than before, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt something stir deep in her chest, a warmth, a quiet joy. She had come to this place seeking solitude, but she had found something more, a reminder that even in the loneliest of places, companionship could be found in the most unexpected forms. Winter stretched on, but it no longer felt quite as cold. The afternoon air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. Autumn had painted the landscape in fiery hues of gold, amber, and deep crimson, and Eleanor Hayes sat on her porch, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, sipping tea from a ceramic mug that had long since lost its original color. She had always loved this time of year. The world seemed quieter, as if nature itself was pausing, taking a deep breath before the long sleep of winter. But something felt different today. She noticed it first in the stillness. The birds, usually chattering away as they flitted between the trees, had gone silent. The rustling of the wind through the pines had ceased. Even the ever-present hum of distant wildlife, squirrels scurrying, the occasional crack of a branch, was absent. It was as if the world had been momentarily suspended. Holding its breath, Eleanor set her mug down on the wooden railing, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her shawl. Her instincts, sharpened by years of solitude in the wild, told her that this was not just an ordinary quiet. Something was watching. Then, from the shadows of the trees, it emerged, a massive grizzly bear, its thick coat a blend of silver and deep brown, stepped forward, its heavy paws pressing into the damp earth with deliberate slowness. It was enormous, easily one of the largest Eleanor had ever seen, its sheer presence dominating the clearing. It did not growl or snarl, did not charge forward in aggression. Instead, it simply stood there, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had seen bears before. Of course. She knew their habits, understood the unspoken rules of coexisting with them. But this was different. This bear was closer than any had dared to come before. And she had no means of escape. Her wheelchair sat motionless beside her, its wheels useless on the uneven wooden planks of the porch. Even if she could reach inside for her rifle, she knew it would be too late. She was trapped. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. But she did not move. Fear coiled in her chest, sharp and constricting, but she forced herself to stay still. Running was not an option, nor was screaming. She had to trust the land. Trust the unspoken balance that had kept her safe all these years. The bear exhaled heavily, a deep rumbling breath that sent a small cloud of mist into the cold air. Its nose twitched, taking in her scent, its head tilting slightly as if trying to understand this strange, unmoving creature before it. Eleanor swallowed hard. She did the only thing she could think to do. She met its gaze. For a long moment, nothing happened. It was a standoff of sorts. Though Eleanor knew there was no real competition here. The bear was an apex predator, a force of nature. She was simply an old woman, small and fragile in comparison. And yet, something passed between them in that moment, an understanding. Perhaps, she had lived long enough to know that nature did not act without reason. Everything had its purpose. This bear had come here for something. But what? Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely more than a whisper. "What do you want, old boy?" The bear did not flinch, did not react as a human might. It only took a slow, careful step forward, its massive claws curling slightly into the wood of her porch. Eleanor held her breath. Then, as if answering her silent question, it shifted its weight slightly, revealing something behind it, a smaller shape, almost hidden in the shadow of its enormous form. A cub. Eleanor's lips parted slightly in surprise. The little one was barely past infancy. Its fur still shaggy, its steps unsteady. It clung close to the larger bear, peering up at Eleanor with wide, nervous eyes. A mother. The realization hit her like a cold wind. This was no lone wanderer, no aimless predator looking for easy prey. This was a mother with her child. And something was wrong. Eleanor's fear did not vanish, but it dulled slightly beneath a deeper instinct, curiosity. She had seen mother bears before, but they were fiercely protective, rarely venturing close to human dwellings unless food was scarce. And yet, this one stood before her now. Not aggressive, not threatening, just watching. Her eyes flicked over the cub, searching for signs of injury. It was not limping, not visibly wounded, but there was something in the way it pressed close to its mother. Something uncertain. Hunger. Perhaps. Eleanor hesitated. She knew better than to feed wild animals. It disrupted the natural order, made them dependent on humans, which often led to tragic endings. And yet, this was different. The mother bear was not digging through her garbage, was not scavenging like a desperate creature. She had brought her cub here, to Eleanor, deliberately. Eleanor reached slowly for the small table beside her, where her morning's leftover biscuits sat on a plate. It was not much, but it was something. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked one up, holding it out in the open, offering, but not forcing. The bear did not lunge, did not snatch it from her. Instead, it watched her for a long moment. Then, with careful precision, nudged the cub forward. Eleanor's breath caught. The cub hesitated but, with an endearing sort of clumsiness, took a few tentative steps forward. Its tiny nose twitched as it sniffed the biscuit. And then, with the softest brush of fur against Eleanor's outstretched fingers, it took the offering. A warmth spread through her chest. She did not know why, but she felt something shift in that moment. A connection, fragile yet undeniable. The mother bear made a soft, low sound, almost approving. Then, just as carefully as they had come, they turned away, disappearing once more into the golden embrace of the trees. Eleanor sat there for a long time after they were gone, her tea long forgotten, her hands still trembling slightly from the encounter. She had always believed she understood the rhythms of the wild, the delicate balance of life and survival. But today, she had been given a glimpse of something else, something deeper. A reminder that even in the vast, untamed wilderness, there was room for trust, for understanding. That night, as she lay in bed, listening once more to the familiar sounds of the forest, she found herself smiling. She was not alone in this world. And perhaps, in some small, unspoken way, she never had been. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the porch, bathing the forest in warm hues of amber and rust. Eleanor Hayes sat motionless, her hands resting lightly on the wooden arms of her wheelchair, her breath slow and measured. The massive grizzly bear stood just a few yards away, its dark eyes locked onto hers. It was thin, too thin for a creature that should have spent the summer gorging itself in preparation for winter. The heavy muscle and fat that typically padded a bear's frame were absent, leaving behind a sharpness in its form that spoke of long hunger and harder days. Eleanor had seen this before. A bad summer, a lack of fish, too much competition. The delicate balance of nature had tilted against this one. And now, as the days grew colder and food became even scarcer, desperation had driven it here. To her, she knew the risk. A starving bear was unpredictable, dangerous. Its instincts were sharper than its caution. And if hunger took control, there would be no reasoning with it. It could charge in an instant, a force of muscle and claws that no human, least of all a 79-year-old woman in a wheelchair, could hope to withstand. And yet, she did not feel fear. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was something deeper. She had lived long enough to understand that fear was useful only when it led to action, not panic. And so, instead of shrinking away, instead of scrambling to get inside and lock the door, she did something else, something that Richard would have called reckless, something that common sense would have warned against. She reached slowly, deliberately, for the woven basket at her side. Her fingers brushed against the rough fabric of the napkin that covered the small loaf of bread she had baked that morning. It wasn't much, just flour, water, and a bit of salt. Nothing fancy, but it was food. And at this moment, food was the only language that mattered. She tore off a small piece, careful not to make any sudden movements. The bear's eyes flicked downward, watching her hands with quiet intensity. Eleanor could see the way its muscles tensed, the way its breath came faster, as if anticipation warred with caution. She held the bread lightly for a moment, then, with the same gentle motion, tossed it onto the ground between them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bear remained still, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the offering. It hesitated, as if uncertain, as if weighing the risks of approaching. Hunger versus fear, instinct versus caution. Eleanor did not move. She simply waited. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, the bear lowered its massive head, its nose hovering just above the small piece of bread. Another pause, another breath, and then, finally, it took it, not with the desperation Eleanor had expected, not with the frenzied hunger of a starving animal, but with something else, something almost delicate. Its black lips curled around the bread, and with a slow, careful motion, it lifted its head again, chewing thoughtfully, its eyes never leaving Eleanor's. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped from her chest. She had expected, she wasn't sure what. Aggression, frenzy, a fight or flight reaction. But there was none of that. There was only the sound of the bear's quiet chewing, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant call of a raven somewhere above. She reached for another piece, tore it in half, and tossed it slightly farther away. Again, the bear hesitated, its ears twitching slightly, but this time, it did not wait as long. It stepped forward, just a single, careful step, and took the second piece just as gently as the first. Eleanor's heart beat steady and strong. She knew she had crossed into something rare. Something fragile. This was not domestication. This was not taming. This was a moment. Nothing more. A moment where two creatures, each alone in their own way, met in understanding. The bear finished the second piece and exhaled. A deep, rumbling sound that Eleanor might have mistaken for a sigh. Its hunger was not gone, but the desperation in its eyes had softened. Just a little. Eleanor studied it more closely now. It was an older bear, perhaps past its prime. Scars lined its flank, evidence of past battles, past hardships. Its fur was patchy in places, thinner than it should have been. It had fought for its survival before, and now, it was fighting again. "You're not so different from me, are you?" she murmured. The bear's ears twitched, as if responding to her voice, though it did not retreat. Eleanor had long believed that animals, especially those who lived in the wilderness, understood more than humans gave them credit for. They recognized tone, presence, intention, and this bear who had come to her, not with aggression but with quiet need, seemed to understand that she was not a threat. She considered giving it more, but she knew better. It would not be right. One moment of kindness was one thing, dependency was another. If it learned to associate her with food, it might come back again and again, and that was a dangerous path for both of them. So instead, she simply sat there, watching, waiting. The bear lingered for a few more moments, its heavy breaths misting in the cooling air. Then, with slow, lumbering steps, it turned, retreating back toward the trees. It did not look back. It did not hesitate. Eleanor exhaled deeply, feeling the tension finally leave her body. She was alone again, and yet, not. Something in her had shifted. She had faced down a force of nature, had met it not with fear but with trust, and it had chosen to meet her in kind. That was not nothing. That was something rare, something precious. The wilderness had always been her refuge, her sanctuary. She had come here seeking solitude, seeking quiet, but now, she understood more clearly than ever, she was not alone in this place. The animals, the trees, the wind that whispered through the branches, they were all part of something greater. Something vast and unspoken, and she, in her own way, was part of it too. The bear did not leave. Eleanor had expected it to. Had braced herself for the moment it would take what little she had offered and retreat back into the wilderness, slipping into the shadows of the trees like so many creatures before it. But instead, it sat, its massive frame lowered slowly to the ground, its limbs folding beneath it with the weariness of something that had walked too far, fought too long. It let out a slow, deep breath, a sound that was not quite a sigh, not quite a growl, but something in between, a sound of resignation. For the first time, Eleanor saw it clearly, not just a bear, not just a predator, but a creature on the edge. It was not just hungry. It was tired, and maybe even hurt. She frowned, her sharp eyes scanning its thick coat, searching for signs of injury. At first, she saw nothing beyond its lean frame, the way its ribs pressed slightly against its fur. But then, just above its front leg, near the shoulder, a patch of matted fur, darker than the rest, blood, not fresh, not pouring, but dried, caked into its coat, a wound, old enough to have stopped bleeding but not old enough to have fully healed. A fight, perhaps, or an accident, a deep gash from another bear's claws. Or maybe a failed attempt at hunting something too strong. Whatever had happened, it had left this bear not just starving, but weakened. It had not come here to hunt. It had come here because it had nowhere else to go. Eleanor exhaled, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her shawl. There was nothing she could do. Not really. She was not a vet, not a healer, and even if she had been, What could she have possibly done for a creature so large? So utterly wild? But she could sit. So she did. For a long time. There was only silence between them. The kind of silence that was not empty, but full, filled with the weight of two beings existing in the same moment. The same space, bound by nothing except the strange, unspoken understanding that neither was a threat to the other. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, her joints aching from the crisp autumn air. She had lived a long life, seen more than her fair share of people come and go. But this was different. There was no expectation here. No need to fill the quiet with words. The bear's breathing was slow, steady. It watched her, its dark eyes half-lidded, heavy with exhaustion but not fear. If it had been any other creature, any other time, she might have reached out. But this was not a pet, not a stray dog looking for a hand to rest upon. This was something older, something primal, something that belonged to the wild. Even in its weakness, Eleanor found herself speaking, though she wasn't sure why. "You remind me of myself," she murmured. The bear did not react, but she continued anyway, her voice soft, barely more than a whisper. "Old, tired, looking for something that used to be there but isn't anymore." Her fingers traced the edge of her shawl absently. "I know what it is to outlive things, to outlast them, and I know what it is to be alone." The words felt strange on her tongue. She had never been the kind of woman who voiced such thoughts aloud. But here, in the presence of this creature, it felt right. She didn't expect a response. Of course she didn't. And yet, as if in quiet acknowledgement, the bear let out another slow breath, its massive body settling slightly against the earth, its weight sinking into the cold ground like it had carried too much for too long. For a while, they just sat. Eleanor did not know how much time passed, minutes, maybe hours, but eventually, the distant hum of an engine broke the stillness. Tom. His truck rumbled up the narrow dirt road, the tires crunching over fallen leaves. The familiar sound pulling Eleanor out of her quiet trance. She turned her head slightly, watching as the old red pickup came into view, its headlights flickering against the encroaching dusk. The bear stirred. It did not bolt, did not panic. Instead, it stood with slow, careful movements, its muscles shifting beneath its thick coat. For a moment, Eleanor worried, not for herself, but for Tom. He was a good man. But he was practical, and practical men did not look kindly upon wild things near human homes. The truck rolled to a stop a few yards away, and Eleanor saw Tom's face through the windshield, his expression frozen between concern and disbelief. The bear turned its head toward him. Tom did not move, neither did the bear. A long moment passed, thick with something unspoken. The air between them was charged, but not with fear, something else, something older. Then, as if making a choice only it could understand, the bear exhaled one last time and turned away. It did not run, it did not glance back. It simply walked, one slow, heavy step after another, back toward the forest. Eleanor watched until it disappeared into the trees, the fading light swallowing it whole. Only then did Tom step out of the truck, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Jesus, Eleanor," he muttered, pushing his hat back on his head, his voice laced with something between exasperation and admiration. "I swear, one day you're gonna give me a heart attack." Eleanor let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Not today, Tom." Tom glanced toward the trees, then back at her. "That bear could have killed you." Eleanor nodded, as if acknowledging the truth of it. "But it didn't." Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew better than to argue. Instead, he glanced at her with a wry smirk. "You planning on adopting it?" Eleanor laughed, the sound rich and real. "I think it adopted me first." Tom shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he started unloading supplies from the truck. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her eyes still lingering on the tree line where the bear had vanished. She knew it would not return. But in some strange way, it didn't need to. The connection had already been made. And sometimes, that was enough. Tom stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his weathered hands gripping the strap of the supply bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes flicked from Eleanor to the retreating figure of the bear as it disappeared into the trees. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Eleanor, I swear, you've got more lives than a damn cat," he said finally, exhaling in disbelief. Eleanor just smiled. It wasn't amusement. Not exactly. It was something deeper, something quieter, a realization settling in, as gentle and inevitable as the first snowfall of winter. For so many years, she had chosen solitude. She had told herself it was by necessity, that she was better off alone, that it was easier this way. People left, people died, the pain of loss never faded, only dulled, and she had decided long ago that she would not let herself be vulnerable to it again. And yet, here she was, not alone, not truly. She had spent decades believing that isolation was her shield, her protection against the sharp edges of the world. But now, staring at the empty space where the bear had stood, she felt something shift inside her. The world had found her anyway. Tom was still watching her, waiting for some kind of explanation. But what could she say? That she and the bear had understood each other. That she had looked into its eyes and seen a reflection of her own weary soul. That, for a brief moment, two creatures who had spent too long in the wilderness of their own making had shared something neither of them could fully name. She only shrugged. He was just passing through. Tom snorted. "Yeah, well, let's keep it that way. You ever think about moving back into town, Eleanor? Maybe getting a little closer to civilization?" Eleanor looked past him, toward the forest, toward the fading light where the bear had gone. "No," she said softly, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't argue. He never did. He just muttered something about stubborn old women and started unloading supplies from the truck. Eleanor sat back in her chair, watching the sky shift to dusk. She knew the bear was gone. Maybe it wouldn't come back. Maybe it would. And yet, over the next few days, she found herself looking toward the trees more often. Not with fear, not with expectation, just watching. She had lived among the wild things long enough to know that nature did not work on human schedules. It did not make promises, but it did leave signs, if you knew how to look for them. And then, one morning, she found them. Dawn was just beginning to stretch pale fingers of light over the snow-covered ground when she opened her cabin door. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that cut straight to the bone. But it was clean, fresh, untouched, except for the tracks, large, deep imprints in the snow, leading from the trees to her porch. Eleanor stared at them, her breath curling in the air. The bear had been here. It had not lingered, had not waited for her to wake. But it had come, it had stood where she now stood. And then it had gone again, slipping back into the shadows, into the life it was meant to live. She did not need to see it to know it was still out there. Somewhere. She did not need to call it, did not need to beckon it back. It had left its mark. And that was enough. As Eleanor traced the prints with her eyes, something settled in her chest, something warm, something steady. She was not alone. She had never been. She had spent years building walls around herself, believing they would protect her. But in the end, it was not the walls that had kept her safe. It was the quiet, unexpected moments of connection. She looked up toward the trees, toward the place where the bear had vanished. And she smiled. Solitude, she realized, was not a sentence. It was not something to be endured. It was an open door. And sometimes, if you were patient enough, something, or someone, would walk through it. even if only for a little while, even if only to leave their footprints behind.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.